So now that we see all of these spaces out there, we're starting to get good data back. It turns out that we're 39 times less likely to have a hospital visit when your senses are engaged than when they're not. And if we just do plastic and steel and rubber, they're not. So the injury rates go up. So if you look at bullying, we can drop school bullying by 87%. So that's sort of a crazy number of lower bullying rates just by changing the environment that you play in. If we teach outside, the information becomes more sticky. It stays in your head longer. As an exercise, I'm going to challenge you right now. Think of the favorite thing that you did when you were a kid. I'll show you an image of mine. I don't know if I can share my screen or not.
Sharing is enabled.
We're okay? All right. So I'll just do this here. So I'll show you, this is basically what I did when I was a child. And I want you to think about the thing that you did that was your favorite thing, whether it is your favorite thing, maybe when you were sort of 7 years old. And this was mine. So mine's not very complicated. Because of where I lived, I was really lucky. This was like somewhere up behind the city that I was in, and this is where I spent my time. So I want you just to think about your favorite thing, and then I want you to answer, the simple question: how many senses of the 5 basic senses? Because there's more. We don't have to talk about the other ones. 5 basic senses. How many were engaged in your favorite thing to do when, as a 7, 8-year-old? For me, it's obvious. I look at mine; it's all 5. So I'm going to ask you, Tanuj, Alaya, how many senses were engaged for you in your favorite thing that you're thinking of when you were 7 years old?
I think I had quite a similar experience. I would love to go around making things with mud. So I had a similar experience as well.
Yeah. So all 5 senses, smell, sight, sound, taste, touch. How about you, Alaya?
Yeah, I used to play with my father like in our lawn in the front when I was 7. So I think that's also all the 5 senses except for taste because I didn't taste stuff there, but like except for 5, I had 4 of my senses engaged.
So the interesting thing is when you do the research on your favorite memories, the things that stick with us, the information that's sticky, that information becomes sticky when your senses are engaged. And it's a trick question because everyone will have 4 or 5 of those senses lit up by those favorite experiences. And if you don't, they're not your favorite experiences. It's how we're wired as human beings. So if you think about how we teach at school, for the most part, there are no senses being engaged at all. So even though we know that the most important, significant memories that we have that stay with us, the information becomes sticky in a sensory environment. We're building environments for children that aren't sensory, that aren't engaging their senses. And by definition, we're not building their favorite places to be. So all of our work is not just around nature, but how do we actually engage their senses so that they're fully using their brain, so that they're more likely to be successful and think laterally and be creative and be imaginative, which is what we need more of right now. And the data starts to back that up. Neuroscience backs that up.
That is an incredible story, Mr. Bienenstock. It's fascinating to hear how your journey began and how it's been going from your childhood. I wish the answer to everything was playing. Now,
Yeah, well,
thinking,
it's a much easier way to go for the play versus work. I like that. That's my job.
that's amazing. Now, thinking back to your journey, what were some challenges that you might have faced along the way, and what kept you going through all of them?
Yeah, so I'll start with my very first playground I ever designed, which is when I knew I had to stop working for rich people. And my very first one was I was asked to design a playground for them in their backyard. And so I did. I designed a little stream, and there was water in the bottom of it, and there was a log that went over it, and there's a little rope that you could get onto underneath, and you would bang into the rocks and the log while you're in there. And I brought this to them. I was very proud. I hand drew this, and I thought, okay, this is beautiful. They're going to love this. And I showed it to them, and they patted me on the shoulder and said, "That's very nice, Adam, but we were looking for a playground." And so, and I knew instantly that they were wrong. They're obviously wrong. What I drew was better. That's more fun than something that's prescriptive. It's this was better. And so the challenges that I faced, really it comes back to that grown up suck thing. There's a lot of regulatory process that goes into playgrounds. What most people don't understand is that the regulatory process is actually designed, especially in North America, by the manufacturers of the playgrounds. So in order to comply with the standard, often you have to buy a new playground in order to comply with these standards. And the people who wrote the standard that you need to comply to are the ones selling you the equipment so that you become compliant. So that becomes a problem if you're not part of that group. So I joined the standard writing committee, and I started to get more involved in the research so that I would have the evidence to be able to make sure that everyone understood, at least I understood the standard as well or better than the people making the decisions around inspections. So it was hard study and research that put me into the position to be able to say, no, actually, Mr. Inspector, I'm sorry, you're wrong. Because what you're quoting is just a word at the back in the addendum to the standard, and the standard clause is this, and you're using the standard wrong. And let me explain to you, and then I would be able to show them. They didn't like me very much for this, but it allowed us to get these things to happen. So that was the first one. The second one is, and my mother is very good at reminding me about this. She said, "How can this be a job? You're just telling people to do what you did when you were a kid. That can't be a real job." So there was this idea that unless it looked like something that grown-ups had created, that had been prescribed and designed and manufactured and studied, it wasn't good enough. And the truth is that the stuff that was studied and manufactured was being designed so it could be sold and mass produced, not so that it could have a positive effect on child development. They're very different things. So we were up against a group of people who were, I mean, in the world, it's billions of dollars of plastic and steel playgrounds that are being produced that are not in any particular way, certainly when you look at the data, they're not necessarily better. I'm just going to pull up an image, and I'm going to show you some things here. So the idea, when I would go and I started to be asked to go give talks, and so I would say, I would go give my my talks on playground design, and inevitably there would be inspectors and manufacturers in the room, because most of those rooms that I was giving talks in were where they all gathered, who would say, "Well, no, you're not following the rules." And the answer would be, "Well, first, your rules are stupid." And I have a bit of a loud mouth, so I was quite happy to say that. And secondly, here's exactly why that's a problem. Because what we need in the world today, and what ultimately we need solutions that are more environmentally friendly and that are going to actually sequester carbon, not burn it. We need solutions that are more effective at allowing children to fully play collaboratively and to de-stress and to be able to think. And the third one is we need opportunities for people to think more imaginatively and more fully. I'm going to show you 3 quick images. And I want because I'm going to ask your reactions to them. So I showed this to everyone sees something different. The problem with play when it's prescribed, when it's plastic and steel and preformed and prefabbed, is that there's one way to use that thing. You go up this way, you go down that way, and there's one way to use it. It doesn't spur on imagination. So I'm going to ask you, when you look at this crazy log here, what do you see? Alaya, do you see anything when you look at that?
It looks like a dog, like that's looking towards the right side.
Exactly what I think, and now I can't see anything but a dog. How about you, Tanuj?
To me, it also looks like it can be used as a bench to sit down and have a chat, maybe.
So when I showed this, the first time I showed this picture, the first hand that came up was an injury prevention expert who said it looks like splinters to me. So that's when you ask what my challenges are perception. So here we are with 39 times lower hospital visits on playing on things that are natural. And the perception is that it's more dangerous. So I'm going the wrong way here. So I'm going to show you this. So this is one thing that comes up a lot. So a lot of people say, yeah, it's a dragon. And we've had a lot of people who look at this thing and say it's a dragon. There's the dog. This is the only thing I see. I see a schnauzer on this one. So, but everybody sees something different. And if it's prescriptive and it's one thing, then it's only ever that thing. But if it's not, and you're following the shape of that, and you're allowing nature to actually tell you what it is, then it becomes something more. And it becomes a bench, and it becomes a science experiment, and it becomes a place where you find the bugs, and it becomes the odd splinter here and there, but that is okay. That is not a hospital visit. That's tweezers. It's okay. So those perceptions of grown-ups are constantly what we battle when we're thinking about how to have more imaginative, more engaging play.
Your perseverance through changing people's perspectives about things that may be necessarily right, but they don't necessarily perceive it like that, that's actually very motivational. Our next question is slightly more practical. What should
Okay.
someone keep in mind if they want to create a natural playground themselves?
Yeah. So I don't think it has to be all that complicated. But I'm going to talk about 4 things that we have in each of the playgrounds that we build. Most of the time when people think about playgrounds, you think about the gross motor, large muscle, physical play. And that's the only thing that people are focused on. And it is an important thing, don't get me wrong, but it isn't the only thing. So when you're designing a playground, you can't just think about large muscle, because the truth is that when we look at the research around just physical play that's being presented on a flat piece of rubber with a structure that says you're going to go up here and across there and down there, and you might climb up this other thing, but those are the things that the grown-ups decided were good for you, so you're going to do those things. 80% of the physical activity on those kinds of play structures, post and platform, plastic and steel, 80% of the physical play is only happening from 20% of the children. So it's not spread evenly amongst all of the children, because different children play in different ways. So when you're thinking about a playground and play, you need to be thinking about the other 80% of the children who aren't interested, first of all, in only physical play. So there are 4 things. There's the gross motor piece that we just talked about, and we should be doing something that involves that. But we also need to be thinking about fine motor. So that's the little things that you can manipulate and touch. Those are materials that can move like sand, or there's a million different types of materials that you can play with and touch. And then we need to think about creative, dramatic play. So that might be art, that might be boards that they can have access to chalk or water, or that is how you would build something, make something. It might be making a fort. So loose parts become part of that. So that's important. And then there's the last one that we miss most often, which is quiet contemplative play. So when a big group is there, there are people who would like to just be able to sit underneath a group of shrubs and not have to deal with all of the mayhem of the A-type kids who are going bonkers, jumping up and down and running around and having some game, because children play in different ways. So all four of those things are important: gross motor, fine motor, creative dramatic play, as well as quiet contemplative space. So if you think about them and think about how you're going to divide your space up to honor each of those different types of play, and then think about how to do that in a sensory way, you'll end up with a much better space when you're designing. If you just think, oh, do what the other playgrounds do, 80% of your audience is going to be lost. They're not going to be interested anymore.
That is quite interesting, that while making a playground, you have to consider all of these factors, but it's quite simple. I have an add-on question to this question. What are some key elements in your project in terms of design and landscape architecture that you would want to keep in mind? And do you have an instance or a story where you might have added these four main elements into play?
Yeah, why don't I show you a couple examples of that? I'll show you some on the school basis, and I'll show you some a couple that are public space. So first, I'll show an early childhood. Maybe I'll show this one first. I'll show a quick before and after of these here. So yeah, and I'll sort of talk through the theory as we go through a few examples of this then. Share screen. So here's a before picture of just an early childhood space that we created. And this is a fairly typical kind of playground. It's a rubber surface and there's a couple of things in it. And they're supposed to go play on those things. There is not shade, there are not natural surfaces, there aren't loose parts to play with. So there's a lot of things missing from this as in terms of how we would look at these things. So 3 months later, this is the space, the same space, when we go and rebuild that space. So it's exactly the same angle, the same space. So I'll toggle back and forth for you. But the difference is now there's loose parts, there's fine motor places, there's places to tuck away in amongst the groups of shrubs. Instead, we've changed the grades significantly. Now there's actually a little hill slide. So there's a slide in the hill and the grade slopes. The pathways are still accessible. It still meets all of the standards for accessibility, but now it's alive. They have different types of play in different places and in different stations. And that's sort of the theme of our stuff. You won't see just one, look at that. We won some awards in the US for a project that we did. This is while we were building it. And this is what it looked like, from above. Now, 6 months later, when we asked the children what they loved, and I'm proud of the work, in landscape architecture awards, the stream in here that you can see in the center of this shot, that stream actually is habitat. So it's an unbelievably beautiful place, but they didn't have any place of play in this. They needed to have a formal place of play. This was as formal as it gets. We built a stream for spawning for the fish, so that the fish were spawning right where they were right where they were playing in the stream that we had built with a recirculation pump. And 5-6 months later, when we asked the children their favorite place in this picture, because we do that after we finish, more than half of them pointed to the forest behind what we built. Not at what we built, but at the forest behind, because that was their favorite place to play. And as a designer, you always want them to pick your stuff, but they're right. They're obviously right. At our best, we're creating these natural spaces that mimic some of the things that happen in the forest on its own, where there's more things to play with, more things to hide behind. Those are the things that get kids much more excited. So I know we're talking about things that I would have designed, and I am proud of the work, but we have to always keep it in mind that these natural forms, this is a study of the Mississippi River, these natural forms over time, the rivers would have flowed through where we now live in the cities. We built the cities over this type of pattern of land. So when we go back in and take over land and there's water moving across it or not, we're trying to mimic those shapes, those natural shapes that would have been there before. So this was an open field with a marsh that had been created by the builder who had dammed a big subdivision behind this, had dammed this off. So this was all marshland. We're trying to mimic those patterns so that there's a place to move through and move to, and it doesn't have to be formal play. It can be very informal play. We're very lucky in some of our work because we get to work with these natural systems. This is a man-made creek from what was marsh and was dammed by a developer that had run amok. Edge of that, there's formal play as we get quite close to this. That play can be as simple as a sideways tree. So we added ropes to it so that there's vestibular motion so that they can move. In the background, that's a set of swings that spin in every direction. So our version of play structure, again, it's a non-prescriptive approach, and we are using the natural form. Our carvers, our staff, our people on my team are told when they arrive, you're never allowed to carve the tree out of the wood. So when we're building, that original form has to be somehow visible to people. Because the other part of this in our cities is that often there's a disconnect between what's real and what isn't real. We need this to be real. We need there to be a place. I can tell you that over time, this is quite new early on, but there are places on this, on the end of this, and on the edge of that, where you can see the oils from people's hands rubbing their hand across the top of that piece, because there's an affinity to this. We're hardwired on an evolutionary scale to like these things and to want to put our hand on those things. So you can see the patterns that people have when you're using these natural materials. So for us, play, this is fully compliant with every regulation that there is. And then the last thing I'll mention is we pay more attention. I hate this ramp thing, but that was part of a city ordinance that we had to have there, but it doesn't matter. But if you look at the background of this, you'll see boulders and stumps and logs and so on as a border around what is required in North America as a giant pit of impact rated surface so that you can't fall onto something. I will tell you that if you make those borders interesting, everything should be interesting. You shouldn't be thinking about transitions between two surfaces as something where you're going to do something boring. It should be interesting. It should be a place where another game can appear, where another way of touching and feeling and standing up, where a young child who's just starting to learn to walk can go in and put their hands on that and pull themselves upright and stand for the first time. So the height matters. Even at that level, at that detail, the little heights matter, because you're going to have very young children coming with their mother and their grandfather and their older sibling, their older brother or sister. And there needs to be something that works for all of those different age groups at all of those different ability ranges that separates them a little bit, but they still get to play together. So every aspect of it has to be regarded with what we call play affordance. Play affordance isn't specifically designed for play according to all the regulations and the grown-ups that make regulations around the play structure. That's for the thing you're looking at in the middle of this picture. The stuff around the outside, around the edge, how you have a separation between the pathway and the other surface, those borders can all provide play affordance and be just as interesting for children to play on as the thing in the middle. So thinking about every aspect of that is a big part of the sort of ideas and approach that we have when we're manufacturing playgrounds.
Wow, this is very considerate and very kind of you to think about every single age group and every single person's play affordance. And also, you talked about all the different factors, and the images were a great way to see the ideas which you had being put into practice, and it was a great inspiration for us all. Finally, just one last question. How does a natural playground compare to a traditional one? I think you've covered this throughout, but just summarizing. And what benefits does it offer and how many?
Wow. Okay. Uh, if it's okay with you, uh, um, I'll go back to some pictures of traditional playgrounds, and then we can talk about that.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure, we can.
okay. I'll just get set up here. So, I mean, the differences are many. The most important difference between these, and a good way to judge whether or not you're doing a good job at the end, there's two things that we use, the most basic things that we use to see whether or not we're doing better, whether we're doing well enough. Um, so the first one is how many senses can be engaged in the space that you built. That's the first one. The second one is, it's a very simple one. We take out a heat gun and we put it on it. And if it got hotter than it was before, then we screwed up. And if it got cooler, then we did well. So it can be as simple as that, because you'll find out that you cannot do the wrong thing. I'm just going to pull up this one, I think. You cannot do the wrong thing, which is something that's bad for the environment, that's making climate change worse, that's creating a bigger heat island in our cities. These things have to be places that are cooler to be. And yet um, we're seeing things like this, being called natural. And I guess it's natural, I don't know, because there's rubber painted animals on it. I don't understand what makes this natural, but this is actually coming from a natural playground website. And it sort of boggles my mind that we would call that natural. It's hotter than it was before. This is paved areas that are all prescriptive. Every type of play in here, except for, I guess there's some interesting use of paint. I don't know what to say. It's not, to me, this is not good enough. And we're seeing awards in the US right now. This is a green schoolyard award. I guess the tennis court and the artificial turf are the color green. I don't know what to do with this, because this isn't natural either. So we're making it hotter. Now, is it cool? Sure. It's not natural, and it's not doing two things that are important. I think you really need to have, are you making it cooler? And are you hitting all of the senses? Because those two things are critical things for children to develop properly. And I think we have a responsibility to make regenerative landscapes for our children. So we start to look to natural landscapes that are effective, just out in the wild. This isn't a playground, but an understanding of how these systems work, and understanding that in order for it to cool, there has to be much more cover and tree and natural than we would imagine. Those things have the significant, when I was talking about 87% reduction in bullying, we take our cues from the natural world, and then it starts to reduce. These trees all communicate with one another. If you were to actually chop down one of these trees or injure one of these trees, others would take less nutrients. They communicate to one another and drive through their integrated root system more power to the tree that wasn't doing so well, so that it could thrive again. They work as a unit, and they work as a unit through the micro and macroorganisms in the soil below. The carbon capture that's going on in this, 65% of the carbon capture is happening below the surface of the soil, not above in the leaves of the tree, but below in the living soil microbiome. And the people who study this living soil microbiome below the level of the soil are starting to identify these communities of bugs that live there. Mycorrhiza, macrorrhiza. There are funguses and bugs that naturally live amongst these things. You get a 65% better resistance of the trees above when that stuff live below. It turns out that the people who've been studying, like my father, the gut microbiome, were studying the same bugs, the same community of bugs below the soil as above. So when we're thinking about play, we can't be thinking about how we pave it and fence it. That can't be part of this. This is my own son standing in his playground, looking at his friend because they came and put the fence in overnight because they need a fence in order to comply with the regulation. We have to be thinking not about paving and fencing, but we have to be thinking about the experiences that people have when they play together and collaborate together on these natural pieces. It does not have to be complicated. We have to work with arborists and with people who can help us find these things. A lot of this material is free somewhere in the world. There are trees growing in our cities. There are people who manage those trees. Those trees at their oldest come down. So if we start to think about those as our resources, instead of a problem that has to go away, we can start to collaborate a bit better with them to figure out ways to make play more collaborative, more interesting, more engaging memory as we go through that. If we just think about those four things, and then, you're automatically going to get lower temperatures. We're talking about lower temperatures that are dropping on the surface by 20, 30 degrees Celsius on the surface. This isn't like a little bit. This is a massive change in the experience of the people who are there. There's a reason why on standard playgrounds that are paved, very few people actually can last more than 15 minutes because it's just too hot. So if we change that, we can actually change the experience. People become more calm. Your grandparents who are coming to the playground with you can sit off to the side and feel very comfortable under a tree while the rest of you are actually having some decent play. So I'll stop the share for a second.
That is incredible. Now, there are quite a few questions coming in from the audience. So we'd like to open the door to questions from them. We'll take some questions. If any more questions are there, please type them in the chat box. We have a question saying, what are the costs associated with a natural playground compared to a conventional? From a town councillor in Ontario, best way to influence our community to take this approach?
Yeah. So, sorry, could you ask that again? I just missed one part of it.
Yeah. What are the costs associated with a natural playground compared to a conventional? That is.
Yeah. So the main difference between the two, really, and we look at the same budgets, so exactly the same budgets, and we get into very complicated things. I mean, we've had the privilege of working at the national park scale, where we're looking at budgets of $15 million for a playground, which is bonkers. It's a crazy number. But when you're looking at standard play structures, if you're to put in a standard play structure, we look at those budgets and we say, yeah, that's the same budget we're working with. The first projects that we did were all reclaimed materials where we worked collaboratively with arborists and landscapers and landscape associations. And we had very small investments of, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, where that was helping us. You can always improve things, but at its basic level, we're talking about basic landscaping that ideally we change the topography a little bit, that we're thinking about 4 or 5 different types of surfaces, pathways, plant material, and then features. Notice I said features last. I make a living selling features. and that is last. So getting the surface right so that it actually moves, that creates interest for all different age groups. It's a very simple thing. Getting enough plant material that's big enough, and this is where some of the important money has to be spent. You need to spend enough to have the plant material be big enough to be resilient when the children come and run around like maniacs and want to touch and feel everything, because that's going to give you separation between each space. So you need to invest in that plant material, the grade and the drainage first. So if you have money and you have collaborators, spend that money first, and then think about how to add loose parts and how to add a feature. Call your arborists and your tree people who are doing their work, call road builders who might have boulders that they want to get rid of, to bring those in. There's ways to do this very, very inexpensively, but we've always gone with exactly the budgets that other playgrounds were being built for, and we followed exactly those numbers.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer. I hope whoever had asked that question is answered. Um, the next question is what about repurposed materials? Can they be used in natural playgrounds?
Yeah. So honestly, everything that we use is repurposed. That's the whole point. So arborists, road builders, landscapers, what people consider to be waste, and I'm not talking about garbage from garbage trucks, what people consider to be waste in the building industry that's a problem for them can be very, very useful to us when we're building beautiful landscapes. So, I mean, I understand it. Sometimes I go to the quarry and we pick boulders. I would much rather have the annoying boulder that was somehow weathered and rounded, that was in the way of the road builder, that had to move that and get it out of the way because that's in the way of the road I'm building. That boulder can be very valuable to us. That boulder can be generations of people playing and feeling and touching and climbing that piece, and it can anchor the way a space feels. So, and then when it comes to the loose parts, we're also using loose parts that don't have to be very complicated. I am partially deaf because I've run a chainsaw all my life, because I've been doing this work and was building these things myself from the beginning. You can make remarkable things out of interesting pieces. Tree cookies, small sticks, longer sticks for forts. A lot of times we're just building a framework so that people can bring their things in. And if you seed it, if you have an area where you're going to do loose parts where they can manipulate those things, if you place that there, you'll start to see other people bringing things to that to help build their forts. Pieces of string and pieces of rope and with burlap that they can put over it. And you'll see these things start to appear. The only advice I would have is that if you're doing a big loose part piece where it's all kinds of found objects that you're bringing in, that once every month you commit to coming and sort of together with all the children who are playing that, put everything back into its original place so that it can start again. You'll get less hassles from the grown-ups who will get all upset because it's too messy. If you just like reorganize once a month, put everything back, nothing becomes like a permanent piece, and then everyone can start building again. So we often do that when we're using the repurposed materials for play and fort building and loose parts.
I think this is the perfect example of what we would call best out of waste. The next question is, can the same concept of a natural playground be applied to other everyday spaces like schools and offices?
Yeah. So now it's interesting. You said offices. Why did you ask that about? I'm interested in the question about offices. I think that we play everywhere that we are. We're doing hospitals more often now. In our current work, in my current work, we're doing more hospitals and therapeutic spaces at workplaces than I have ever done in my life. The levels of stress that people have reached in after COVID and how we all dealt with it created a lot of stress. My father, a quick reason for this, my father, who studied the effect of gut biome on stress and anxiety, and that relationship that you have with a biodiverse environment is at the core of whether or not you're going to have more stress. And he showed the cause and effect of this, not the correlation of these things, but that one caused the other. Lack of contact with the biodiverse environment causes stress and anxiety. His work was for the U.S. Army for PTSD, showing that you could take these bugs, microscopic in soil, and change the way they felt. So he had identified bugs in soil that had a better effect on post-traumatic stress disorder in Army veterans than any of the current drug formulations. So when you think about how grown-ups react to this, that's the context that we operate in. The biggest problems that we have in offices and at schools around absenteeism of teachers, around absenteeism of our workforce, and of stress reactions in the workforce that reduce productivity, those reactions are happening because of this disconnect. And we can affect huge change by changing that disconnect to a connection to those biodiverse environments. We can't do it unless the places where they work actually have access to them. So when we're thinking about an intervention at a school, for example, I know that I can drop by 40 to 50% the absenteeism and the requirement of new substitute teachers when your major has to go on sick leave. We can reduce the effect of those substitute teachers by changing the environment in which they can teach and play. So as important as play is, outdoor classrooms and places for teachers to teach outside change the way they feel about working there, change the way those aggressive behaviors work there. So we're doing significantly more in hospital situations and it's not purely just to make it pretty. It's there because therapeutically bringing people out there changes the way they feel. We've done one particular one, which is Children's Aid Society, where we've repeatedly done work with young children in hospital, who are there at hospital, but there for therapeutic reasons, or there for families that have become broken because of stress. And we've been building therapeutic places where you can have the interviews, the discussions, and therapies outside in these environments. And the effectiveness of those is significantly better than when you're doing them inside, in a room, face to face, without any of the senses hit. So I think the stress stuff that we're dealing with and that we're seeing the evidence of these environments changing is driving us towards more schools, more office spaces, more hospitals right now.
I never knew that nature could help people deal with stress or help cure such great problems for people. Now let's move on to another question. How do we convince parents who usually want to see big tall slides or other tower structures that shout high play value to them? We've
Yeah,
had them criticize more of what you are describing because they think their kids will be. Does including data and research help in design presentations from your experience?
yeah, I love this question. So I gotta say, like I've said it before, grown-ups suck. We do. We really do. And this perception it's wrong. So I think we have to reframe it. And I think if you want to convince grown-ups, you have to really start to ask questions and listen to their answers. What is most important to them for their children? Don't talk about playground, don't talk about features. Ask them what's most important to them. What's the biggest problem to solve for their children? And you'll have a series of answers that are quite standard. They want them to be safe. Okay, well, we're You want safe one? No problem. When it comes to that's the systematic literature review on play and on risk in play. I'm one of the co-authors of this paper. It's the largest paper review ever done. The most boring thing I've ever done in my whole life is this, but it actually lays out for you exactly, and I'm happy to provide this to you. Actually, I might just there's a couple of really good shares on this. Maybe I'll go to the one slide up here. So I'm just going to share this because it's an easy one. There's two things in here worth looking at that'll address specifically some of those parental concerns. And one of them I was involved in. One of them actually my father was on the periphery involved in. So I think the statement has to be, okay, first off, we're not talking about connection to nature as something that we have to solve. What I'm saying is that the connection to nature is the biggest solution to the biggest problems that you have today. So you have to start with finding out what are the problems that parents need to solve. Is it aggressive behaviors and bullying at the school and their child's being bullied? Okay, we have a solution for that. We can drop that by 87% by building. Is it that they want academically their children to do better, reading, writing, STEM scores, science, technology, engineering, math? If they're interested in those things, I can improve those scores more by doing this than they can ever improve. By a factor of 3 times, I can improve their scores more with our intervention in play versus the standard intervention that they're talking about. So if it's injury rates, we can do 39 times better on the injury rates. This is that study at the top there. If it's their immune system, we want them to be healthy. We want them to be able to be physically healthy. The Helsinki alert was interesting because there's a guy named Richard Louv who used to talk about this idea of nature deficit disorder. He had this phrase that he used. He always says, well, it's not a medical diagnosis. Nature deficit disorder is something I made up to just sort of describe all of this stuff I'm researching. He's a journalist. But now the Helsinki alert says, no, the biodiversity hypothesis tells us that if these children do not have access to this, they will get sick. This nature deficit disorder is a problem. It is at the core of Crohn's disease. It is the core of irritable bowel disease. It's at the core of cancers and diabetes. A better predictor of type 1 diabetes than what they eat when they're 30 is whether or not they've had an interaction with a biodiverse environment before they're 9. So I'm going to say that one again. A better predictor of their health and whether or not they're going to get diabetes later, better than their food that they eat, is whether or not they've played in that biodiverse environment and touched that and gotten their gut microbiome set up. And they're not going to get it unless you design places every day that they can go to where they can get some of all of that. Last thing I'll say, grown-ups want to be heard just like kids want to be heard. We all just want someone to listen to us. So ask them the questions about what's most important to them first, and then be ready for the arguments that say, we can improve that for you. We're not saying that everything has to be this, but this must be a choice. It must be one of the places that they can go to. And then let the kids decide, because I tell you what happens if you put them side by side. You end up with kids playing over there with the forts and the building and the loose parts and the sideways trees more than you end up on the plastic and steel, which is off to the other side. For the first 2 months, everyone goes to the new thing, but for the next year, they will all be playing collaboratively on the other stuff. And then make sure there's lots of seats, because grown-ups are also relatively lazy, and put the seats far enough away from the play so that they can sit down somewhere and not actually be able to yell at you.
I think these are some quite interesting inputs that we have gotten, but because we're slightly short on time, we would like to we'd like to conclude this session. So, Mr. Bienenstock, we are deeply grateful for your time and the insights that you've shared with us today. It's been an eye-opening experience to learn about the importance of natural playgrounds and how they can transform the way children interact with the nature and with the playgrounds that they're playing in.
This conversation has truly sparked new ideas and possibilities. We're excited about the future and the potential to bring natural playgrounds to India. We hope that today's webinar inspires more people to think about how we can make our cities more child friendly through thoughtful and sustainable design like natural playgrounds.
We would just like to thank, we would just also like to thank Casey ma'am for giving us this opportunity to host this webinar and interact with Mr. Adam Bienenstock, because it's been a wonderful experience for all of us.
Thank you.
Yes. Um, I think that, Adam, it's been really, really inspiring as always. I love listening to you and looking at the questions that we are getting. I think we need to have a part two of this webinar, because so many people are interested to know that what this means, and why this is needed. I still believe that this is the need of an hour, that we need this nature back in our children, in their childhood, and even for adults. So thank you so much, Adam, for bringing this to our knowledge and spending time with us. Thank you, Tanuj and Alaya, for hosting this amazing webinar.
Yeah, thank you all for giving the opportunity to speak to your group. Gauri, I'm happy to respond to any of these. There's a great question about longevity, and we have a whole, I do sessions that last a full day on how to improve the longevity of these things. So there's lots of questions out there. I'm happy to answer them, happy to come back. Contact me if you need anything at all. This stuff matters. And I'm really honored that you guys have spent the time to have the conversation. It's this is the first time I've done this format. You are awesome.
Thank you so much. I think with this note, we can end this webinar. We hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and we hope so have a wonderful morning. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, buddy.